The sirens were getting closer. I could hear them cutting through the quiet suburban street while I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by spreadsheets and bank statements scattered across the table like evidence at a crime scene. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, waiting for the police to arrive. Robert was in the living room, his face ashen, realizing that this time I wasn't backing down. This time I had proof. But let me back up 3 months, because that's when everything I thought I knew about my life shattered like cheap glass. I remember the exact moment. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I'd just finished my volunteer shift at the Phoenix Public Library, something I'd been doing every week for the past 5 years. The heat was finally breaking, that first hint of tolerable weather after months of baking Arizona sun. I decided to walk down Central Avenue instead of taking the bus home, treating myself to a caramel latte from that little coffee shop near the art museum. That's when I saw him. Robert, my husband of 37 years, standing outside Cafe Monarch, holding hands with a woman I'd never seen before. And here's the thing that made my stomach drop. She wasn't some young secretary or gym instructor. She was around my age, maybe older, dressed in expensive clothes I could never afford. They were laughing, and the way he touched her arm, so casual and familiar, it wasn't the touch of someone meeting for the first time. I stood there frozen on the sidewalk, people moving around me like water around a rock. My coffee felt burning hot through the cup sleeve. I wanted to march over there, to demand an explanation, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I watched them go inside together, watched through the window as the hostess led them to a corner table. A corner table. The kind you request when you don't want to be seen. I went home. I don't even remember the walk. I just remember standing in our bedroom, staring at the financial documents Robert always kept locked in his desk drawer. The drawer I'd never had a key to because he said it was easier if he handled all the money stuff. I'd trusted him with everything. Our retirement savings, the inheritance from my mother, the accounts we'd built over decades of work. He was the numbers guy, after all. He'd worked in accounting for 30 years before retiring. It made sense that he'd manage our finances. Except now, nothing made sense. That night, when Robert came home around 7, I almost said something. The words were right there, caught in my throat like jagged stones. But he kissed my forehead like he always did, asked about my day like he always did, and settled into his recliner with the evening news like it was just another ordinary Tuesday. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, this man I'd built a life with, and wondered who the hell I was looking at. You probably think I should have confronted him right then. I can hear you screaming at your screen, telling me to demand answers. But here's what people don't understand about betrayal. It doesn't just break your heart. It breaks your reality. Everything you thought was solid ground suddenly feels like quicksand, and you're terrified that if you move too fast, you'll sink completely. So I said nothing. I went to bed that night next to a stranger wearing my husband's face. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., my mind racing. Robert was still asleep, snoring softly the way he had for as long as I could remember. I slipped out of bed and went to his office, the spare bedroom he'd converted into his personal space years ago. His desk drawer was locked, like always. But I'd seen enough detective shows to know that most cheap desk locks can be opened with a bobby pin if you're desperate enough. And God, was I desperate. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 15 minutes to get the lock open. Inside were files, so many files. Bank statements going back years, credit card bills I'd never seen, investment documents with names I didn't recognize. As I started going through them, my chest tightened. There were withdrawals, huge ones, from accounts I didn't even know existed. Money being moved around in patterns I couldn't follow. Our joint savings account, the one I thought had our retirement cushion, had a fraction of what should have been there. I heard Robert stirring in the bedroom. I shoved everything back, relocked the drawer, and practically ran to the kitchen. By the time he emerged, I was making coffee with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I kept thinking about those 37 years. We met when I was 25, fresh out of a failed first marriage, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Robert was 30, stable, reliable. He wasn't exciting, but after my disaster of a first husband, stable sounded like heaven. We built a quiet life together in Phoenix. We never had children, my choice initially, though I'd regretted it by the time I was 40 and it was too late. But Robert said it was fine, that we had each other, that we'd build a different kind of life. And we did. Or I thought we did. Sunday morning farmers markets, evening walks through the neighborhood, dinner with our small circle of friends every few weeks. It wasn't passionate or thrilling, but it was ours. Safe, predictable. Except it was all built on lies I hadn't even known were there. Over the next few days, I became a spy in my own home. I started paying attention to things I'd ignored for years. How Robert always angled his phone away from me. How he'd developed a habit of taking calls in his car, even when he was parked in our own driveway. How he'd bristle when I asked simple questions about our finances, making me feel stupid for not understanding, for not trusting his expertise. One afternoon, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket while doing laundry. Tiffany & Co. $3,000, dated 2 weeks ago. My anniversary gift that year had been a grocery store bouquet and dinner at Olive Garden. That's when the anger started replacing the shock. That cold, clarifying rage that burns away confusion and leaves only sharp edges of understanding. I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. But who could I turn to? Robert had slowly, carefully isolated me over the years. It happened so gradually I didn't notice. First, it was suggesting we didn't need to see my sister so often because she lived in Tucson and the drive was such a hassle. Then it was convincing me that my old college friends were too dramatic, too demanding of my time. One by one, my connections had been severed, always with reasonable-sounding excuses, until my world had shrunk to just Robert and our quiet, controlled routine. Studies show that 48% of people who leave abusive situations suffer online harassment afterward. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to become part of that statistic. I started researching. Late at night, after Robert fell asleep, I'd take my laptop into the bathroom and search for information about financial abuse, about manipulation, about how to protect yourself when your spouse has control of everything. The more I read, the more I recognized my own life in those articles. The isolation, the financial dependence, the subtle ways he'd made me feel incompetent, incapable of handling money or making decisions. I thought about my mother, who died 7 years ago and left me a small inheritance. $50,000. Money she'd saved her whole life, money she wanted me to have for security. Robert had insisted on putting it into a joint investment account he'd manage. For our future, he said. To make it grow, he said. I wondered if any of it was even left. The shame was almost worse than the betrayal. I was 62 years old, not some naive kid. How had I let this happen? How had I been so blind? Studies show that 33% of people are ashamed of how they handle money, and I was definitely carrying that weight. Every time I thought about telling someone what was happening, I imagined their judgment, their pity, their unspoken question. How could you be so stupid? But I wasn't stupid, I was trusting, and Robert had weaponized that trust against me for God knows how long. It was in those dark bathroom hours, scrolling through forum after forum of other women's stories, that I realized something crucial. My dependence on Robert wasn't just emotional or financial, it was psychological. I'd convinced myself that I needed him, that I couldn't function without his guidance, his management of our life. Even now, knowing what I knew, part of me wanted to pretend I'd imagined it all. To crawl back into that comfortable ignorance. Maybe that's why so many people stay. It's not just about money or fear. It's about the terror of dismantling your entire identity and starting over when you thought you were supposed to be settling into your golden years. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror one of those nights. Really looked. The woman staring back at me had gray hair I'd stopped bothering to dye, deepening lines around her eyes and mouth, a tiredness that went bone deep. When had I stopped recognizing myself? When had I become this hollow version of who I used to be? The next morning, Robert announced he was going to play golf with some old work buddies. He'd be gone most of the day. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I went back to that desk drawer. This time, I didn't just look. I photographed everything with my phone. Every statement, every document, every piece of evidence I could find. I found the account where my mother's inheritance should have been. The balance was $73. I found credit cards I'd never seen, maxed out with charges at restaurants and hotels and jewelry stores, places we'd never been together, things I'd never received. I found a lease agreement for a condo in Scottsdale, a luxury condo I'd never heard of, signed 18 months ago. The paper trail was devastating. Robert hadn't just been skimming or mismanaging our money. He'd been systematically draining our accounts to fund an entirely separate life. A life with that woman I'd seen him with at the coffee shop. I was certain of it now. But here's what people don't tell you about discovering betrayal on this scale. You don't just feel angry or hurt. You feel erased. Like the past 37 years of your life were just an elaborate stage production, and you were the only one who didn't know you were performing. I sat on the floor of Robert's office, surrounded by evidence of his deception, and I cried. Not gentle tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere primal, somewhere that knows you've been broken in a way that can't be easily fixed. The kind that makes your whole body shake and your throat raw. But even then, even in that moment of complete devastation, I didn't call him. I didn't confront him, because I was still trapped in the belief that had kept me paralyzed for so long. The belief that I needed him, that I couldn't survive without him, that at 62 I was too old, too dependent, too scared to start over. Have you ever doubted your own sanity? Have you ever known something was wrong but convinced yourself you were overreacting, being paranoid, imagining things? That's what years of manipulation does. It makes you distrust the evidence of your own eyes, your own instincts, your own lived experience. I thought about calling my sister in Tucson. We hadn't spoken in months. Robert always had some reason why now wasn't a good time, why maybe next month we'd drive down for a visit. I'd let those excuses pile up until the distance between us became a chasm I didn't know how to cross. But that day, sitting on that floor, I picked up my phone. My finger hovered over her number, and I couldn't do it. The shame was too heavy, the words too impossible to say out loud. How do you tell someone that you've been a fool? That everything you thought was solid turned out to be smoke? I put the phone down. I put the documents back. I locked the drawer. And when Robert came home that evening with tales of his golf game and a takeout pizza, I smiled and ate dinner and pretended everything was fine. Because I wasn't ready. Not yet. But something had shifted in me that day, sitting on that floor surrounded by evidence. Something hard and cold and clear was beginning to form. A kernel of rage that would eventually burn away everything else. I just didn't know it yet. Over the next week, I became two people. There was the version of me that moved through our daily routine, that smiled and cooked meals and watched TV with Robert in the evenings. And there was the version that existed in the spaces between, the one who was quietly gathering information, documenting everything, preparing for something I couldn't quite name yet. My autonomy had been slipping away for years, so slowly I hadn't noticed. Every decision filtered through Robert. What we ate, where we went, how we spent our time, who we saw. He'd call it partnership, collaboration, but really it was control dressed up in reasonable language. And I'd let it happen because it was easier than fighting, easier than asserting myself, easier than risking his disappointment or disapproval. I'd sacrificed pieces of myself so gradually that by the time I realized what was missing, I couldn't remember what the whole version of me had even looked like. That woman who'd once had opinions and dreams and autonomy, she'd been worn away like stone under water, until all that remained was this shell that moved through Robert's world according to Robert's rules. But that shell was beginning to crack. The breaking point came 2 weeks after I'd seen Robert with that woman. We were at a dinner party at the Hendersons' house, one of those gatherings of couples in their 60s talking about retirement and grandchildren and whose health was failing. Standard Phoenix suburb social hour. I was in the kitchen helping Margaret Henderson with dessert when I heard it. Robert's voice carrying from the living room, talking to Tom Henderson about investments, about how well his portfolio was doing, how smart he'd been with money all these years, how he'd built such a solid financial foundation for our retirement. The lies flowed from his mouth so smoothly, so naturally, like he'd told them 1,000 times before. Maybe he had. How many of our friends had he fed this narrative to? How many people thought we were comfortable and secure while he was draining everything we had? Margaret must have seen something in my face because she touched my arm and asked if I was okay. I managed to nod, to smile, to make some excuse about the heat. But my hands were shaking as I cut the cake, and I could barely hear anything over the roaring in my ears. That's when Shirley Thompson, an acquaintance I'd barely spoken to in years, cornered me by the dessert table. She'd had a few glasses of wine, her words slightly slurred as she leaned in close. "I saw Robert at DeSeo last month," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "With that woman, the one he's always with. They were celebrating something, champagne, the whole deal. I didn't want to say anything, but honey, are you okay? I mean, we all know, but nobody wants to be the one to tell you." The room tilted. We all know. Those 3 words landed like physical blows. I mumbled something, I don't know what, and somehow made it to the bathroom. I locked the door and stood there, staring at my reflection in Margaret's decorative mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, a fool. Someone who'd been betrayed so publicly that even casual acquaintances knew about it, had known about it, while she'd remained oblivious. The humiliation was suffocating. How long had people been whispering about me, pitying me? Watching me play the role of devoted wife while Robert paraded his other life around town. I emerged from that bathroom a different person. I went back to the living room, found Robert still holding court about his financial acumen, and I smiled. I played my part for the rest of the evening. But inside, something fundamental had changed. That night, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror for a long time, really seeing myself, maybe for the first time in years. The exhaustion written in every line of my face, the defeat in my posture. The way I'd physically diminished myself, taking up less and less space, making myself smaller and quieter and more invisible. My reflection was a monument to everything I'd given up. My independence, my voice, my sense of self. I'd become a passenger in my own life, just going along with whatever Robert decided, whatever Robert wanted, whatever narrative Robert chose to construct. And for what? For the illusion of security? For the comfort of not having to make my own decisions? For the privilege of being slowly erased until there was nothing left but an echo of who I'd once been? I thought about my mother then. Fierce, independent, sharp as a tack until the day she died. What would she say if she could see me now, if she knew what I'd become? If she knew what Robert had done with the money she'd saved for me, money she'd wanted me to have for my own security, my own freedom? The shame threatened to drown me. But underneath it, something else was rising. Something hot and clarifying and powerful. Rage. Studies show that 33% of people are ashamed of how they handle money. I was definitely part of that statistic. Standing there at 2 a.m., cataloging all the ways I'd failed myself. But shame, I was learning, could be transformed into something more useful, something sharp enough to cut through decades of conditioning and fear. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Shirley's pitying expression. I heard those words. We all know. I imagined our entire social circle watching my humiliation, whispering about poor, naive me while Robert and his woman lived it up on my mother's inheritance. By morning, I'd made a decision. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I was going to do something. I was done being a passenger, done being small and quiet and compliant. I was going to find out exactly what Robert had done, and then I was going to make him pay for it. The question was how. I had no income of my own. I'd stopped working when we married, and Robert had convinced me there was no need to go back. I had no savings in my own name, no credit cards he didn't control, no financial independence whatsoever. I was trapped, yes, but I wasn't helpless. Not anymore. I spent that day doing research, real research this time, not just scrolling through forums in the middle of the night. I looked up legal aid services. I found resources for women dealing with financial abuse. I learned about forensic accountants and divorce lawyers and how to protect yourself when your spouse controls all the money. Knowledge is power, they say. And for the first time in decades, I was going to arm myself with it. The person who would become my unexpected ally appeared on my doorstep 3 days later. Linda Mercer. A woman I'd barely spoken to in the 5 years since she'd moved away from our street. We'd been neighbors once, had chatted occasionally over the fence, but never what you'd call friends. She stood there with a casserole dish and an expression I couldn't quite read. "I heard what happened at the Hendersons' party," she said. "Can I come in?" I almost said no, almost closed the door on whatever this was. But something in her eyes, something knowing and kind and determined, made me step aside. Linda sat at my kitchen table and told me what she'd suspected for years. That Robert was running a long game. That she'd seen the signs when we were neighbors, seen the way he isolated me, controlled the narrative, managed every aspect of our life together. She'd tried to reach out back then, to build a friendship, but Robert had always found ways to keep us apart. "I didn't have proof," she said, "just a gut feeling. But when I ran into Shirley last week and she told me what she'd said to you, I knew I had to come. Nobody should go through this alone." We spent hours at that table. I showed her the documents I'd photographed. She helped me organize them, make sense of the financial maze Robert had created. Linda had worked in banking before she retired. She understood this stuff in a way I never could. "This isn't just mismanagement," she said, her finger tracing a pattern of withdrawals. "This is systematic theft. He's been siphoning money for years, covering his tracks just well enough that you wouldn't notice unless you knew what to look for." She helped me open a new email account Robert couldn't access, helped me scan and save every document to a cloud storage, helped me create a paper trail that couldn't be erased or denied. For the first time since I'd seen Robert outside that coffee shop, I wasn't alone. I had an ally, someone who believed me, who validated that what was happening wasn't normal or okay, who had the skills to help me fight back. "You're going to need a lawyer," Linda said. "A good one. But first, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Every account, every asset, every debt. The full picture." Over the next 2 weeks, Linda and I became detectives. We combed through years of financial records, created spreadsheets, followed money trails. What we found was staggering. Robert had taken out a second mortgage on our house without telling me, had opened credit cards in both our names and maxed them out, had drained not just my mother's inheritance, but our retirement accounts, our savings, everything we'd built over nearly 4 decades together. The total? Close to $400,000. Gone. Spent on that condo in Scottsdale, on trips with his girlfriend, on a lifestyle he'd been living in parallel to ours for at least 5 years. I should have been devastated, and part of me was. But mostly, I was angry. That cold, focused anger that makes everything crystal clear. Every doubt, every moment of self-blame, every piece of shame. It all burned away in the face of concrete evidence. Robert had stolen my mother's money, had stolen our future, had looked me in the eye every single day for years while systematically destroying the financial security we'd supposedly built together. And he'd done it so smoothly, so confidently, that even when I'd started to suspect, I doubted myself more than I doubted him. "What do you want to do?" Linda asked one afternoon, both of us staring at the damning spreadsheet on my laptop screen. I looked at that number. $400,000. I thought about my mother working double shifts as a nurse, saving every penny. I thought about the years I'd devoted to this marriage, to this man. I thought about the life I could have had if I'd known the truth earlier. "I want everything back," I said. "Every penny. And I want him to face consequences, real ones." Linda nodded. "Then we need to be strategic. We need to document everything, build an airtight case, and when we're ready, we hit him so hard he won't know what happened. I became methodical. While Robert went about his life, thinking I was still the compliant, trusting wife he'd spent decades creating, I was systematically building the case against him. I photographed bank statements. I recorded conversations where he lied about our finances. I tracked his movements, documented his time with the other woman. I pretended everything was normal, smiled when he came home, made his favorite dinners, watched TV with him in the evenings. The whole time I was gathering evidence, preparing for the moment when I would finally confront him with the truth. It was exhausting, maintaining that facade. There were moments I wanted to scream, to throw every piece of evidence in his face, to make him acknowledge what he'd done. But Linda kept me grounded. "Not yet," she'd say. "We need everything documented first. Once you confront him, he'll start hiding things, moving money, covering his tracks. We only get one shot at this." So I waited, and while I waited, I planned. I found a lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Chen, who specialized in complex divorces involving financial abuse. She reviewed everything Linda and I had compiled and let out a low whistle. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases of financial infidelity I've seen," she said. "You've done incredible work documenting this. With what you have here, we can nail him." Hearing a professional validate what I'd discovered, what Linda had helped me uncover, it was like a weight lifting. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. What Robert had done was illegal, actionable, prosecutable. "I need you to do one more thing," Rebecca said. "Open a bank account in your name only. Start building a small reserve. You're going to need money for the legal battle ahead, and you need to make sure he can't cut you off completely." I'd never had my own bank account in all the years of our marriage. Robert had always said joint accounts were simpler, more transparent, more trusting. Now I understood that was just another way to maintain control, to make sure I couldn't accumulate any independence. Opening that account felt revolutionary. It was just a checking account with a few $100s I'd saved from grocery money over weeks, but it was mine, only mine, the first thing that was truly mine in longer than I could remember. I started reclaiming other pieces of myself too. Small things. I got my hair cut and colored, actually colored professionally. Something I hadn't done in years because Robert always said it was a waste of money. I bought new clothes with my secretly saved cash, clothes that made me feel like a person instead of a ghost. I started going to the library not just to volunteer, but to check out books I wanted to read. Mystery novels, thrillers, stories about women who fought back. Robert barely noticed. Or if he did, he didn't comment. Why would he? As far as he knew, I was still safely under control, still the manageable wife who asked for nothing and questioned less. He had no idea I was preparing for war. The confrontation I'd been building toward happened on a Thursday evening in November. I'd chosen the timing carefully. Linda was on standby, Rebecca had all the documents ready to file, and I'd moved anything of sentimental value to a storage unit Robert didn't know about. He came home from wherever he'd really been, certainly not the Rotary Club meeting he'd claimed, to find me sitting at the dining room table. In front of me were printed copies of every bank statement, every credit card bill, every piece of evidence of his 5-year campaign of financial devastation. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was steady. I'd practiced this moment 100 times in my head. I watched the color drain from his face as he took in the documents spread across the table. His eyes darted from paper to paper, and I could actually see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew, how he could talk his way out of this. "Now, honey," he started, that patronizing tone he always used when he was about to gaslight me. "This looks worse than it is. You don't understand how these things work." "I understand perfectly," I cut him off. "I understand that you've stolen $400,000 from us. From me. I understand that you've been living a double life for at least 5 years. I understand that you took my mother's inheritance and spent it on your girlfriend and your secret condo." His mouth opened and closed. For once, Robert was speechless. "I know about the Scottsdale condo," I continued. I know about the trips to San Diego and Vegas. I know about the jewelry you bought that I never received. I know you mortgaged our house without telling me. I know about every lie, every manipulation, every single thing you've done. You're overreacting, he said, finding his voice. You're confused. Let me explain. I'm not confused, Robert. I'm crystal clear. Probably for the first time in decades. He tried a different approach, his face softening into what he probably thought was a conciliatory expression. Look, I made some mistakes. I know that. But we can work through this. We've been together for 37 years. That has to count for something. It counted, I said. It counted right up until I found out our entire marriage was a lie. His expression hardened. You can't prove any of this. I smiled then, actually smiled. I can prove all of it. Every single transaction, every hidden account, every lie. I have bank statements, credit card receipts, photos, recordings. I have everything, Robert, and my lawyer has copies of everything. The word lawyer hit him like a physical blow. He actually staggered backward. You can't do this, he said. You don't have any money for a lawyer. You don't have anything without me. That's what you wanted me to believe, that I needed you, that I couldn't survive on my own. But here's what you didn't count on. I'm smarter than you gave me credit for. And I'm done being small and scared and controlled. We sat there in our dining room, the same room where we'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners and birthday celebrations and countless ordinary meals, and the full weight of what I was doing settled over both of us. I was ending our marriage. I was taking him to court. I was fighting back, and he knew he'd lost. I could have loved you, I said quietly. If you'd been honest, if you'd treated me like a partner instead of a mark. But you chose this. You chose to steal and lie and manipulate. So now we both have to live with the consequences. Robert tried several more angles that night. Anger. How dare I spy on him, invade his privacy? Pleading. He'd made mistakes, but he loved me. We could fix this. Threats. I'd never survive the divorce. I'd end up with nothing. I'd regret this. But I'd heard all these tactics before in my research, in the stories of other women who'd escaped financial abuse. I recognized them for what they were, the last desperate attempts of someone who'd lost control. I didn't engage. I just sat there, watching him cycle through his manipulation playbook, and felt nothing but relief that I'd finally seen through it. When he realized nothing was working, he left. Just grabbed his keys and walked out. I heard his car pull away, and I allowed myself to shake. The confrontation I'd been building toward for months was over. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. Linda arrived 20 minutes later. I'd texted her as soon as Robert left. She found me still sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by evidence, trembling with adrenaline and relief. You did it, she said, pulling me into a hug. You were amazing. I'm terrified, I admitted. Good, she said. Fear means you're taking this seriously, but you're not alone. You have me, you have Rebecca, and you have the truth on your side. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. Rebecca filed for divorce and, simultaneously, for restitution of the stolen funds. We filed complaints with the financial institutions about the fraudulent accounts and the mortgage he'd taken without my knowledge or consent. Robert tried to hide assets, tried to move money, but we'd anticipated that. Rebecca had frozen all the accounts as part of the initial filing. He couldn't touch anything without court approval. The evidence was overwhelming. Robert had left a paper trail a mile wide, confident I'd never look, never question, never challenge him. His arrogance became his downfall. The legal process revealed even more. The woman I'd seen him with, her name was Patricia, had been just as deceived as I was. He'd told her he was divorced, that I was his bitter ex-wife who wouldn't leave him alone. She'd had no idea we were still married, still living together. When she found out the truth, she was horrified and immediately broke things off with him. Robert lost everything. Not all at once, but in a slow cascade of consequences that felt like justice finally catching up. The court ordered him to repay the stolen funds, to sell the Scottsdale condo, to pay my legal fees, to surrender his portion of our home's equity. Our friends, the ones who'd known about his affair, who'd whispered about it at parties, suddenly wanted to stay neutral. But their neutrality felt like complicity. These people had watched me be humiliated and said nothing, had known I was being betrayed and let it continue. I decided I didn't need their friendship anymore. Some people did surprise me, though. Margaret Henderson, whose party had been the scene of my public humiliation, called to apologize. She'd known something was wrong, but hadn't wanted to get involved. Now she regretted her silence, wished she'd spoken up sooner. "I was scared of making things worse," she said, "but I see now that silence just protected him and hurt you." I appreciated her honesty, even if it came too late to change anything. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. 8 months of depositions and court dates and fighting over every asset. Robert tried everything, claimed the money was invested and lost, that I was exaggerating, that I'd known about everything and was just having buyer's remorse about our lifestyle. But the evidence didn't lie, and Rebecca was relentless. In the end, I got the house, my mother's inheritance restored from the sale of his assets, and half of everything we'd built together. It wasn't everything I'd lost. You can't put a price on decades of trust and emotional devastation. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was justice. Robert was also ordered to pay penalties for the fraud, the hidden accounts, the forged documents. His perfect reputation in our social circle crumbled. People knew what he'd done. The whispers that had once been about my ignorance became about his crimes. One afternoon, I ran into Shirley at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to avoid me but couldn't quite manage it. "I heard about the divorce," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," I replied. "I'm not." Her eyes widened. She'd expected shame, I think, embarrassment. But I was done with shame. I'd reclaimed my life, my autonomy, my sense of self. What did I have to be embarrassed about? Studies show that 48% of people who leave abusive situations suffer online harassment afterward. I became part of that statistic when Robert's friends, people I'd thought of as our friends, started posting vague comments on social media about bitter ex-wives and vindictive women who destroy good men. They never named me directly, but the implication was clear. I blocked them all, cut them out cleanly. Anyone who sided with a thief and a liar wasn't someone I needed in my life. The financial recovery was concrete, measurable. But the emotional recovery was harder to quantify. Some days I felt powerful and liberated. Other days I felt lost and grieving for the life I'd thought I had. Therapy helped. Linda recommended a counselor who specialized in financial abuse and betrayal trauma. Dr. Sarah Kim helped me understand that what I'd experienced was a specific type of psychological manipulation designed to keep me dependent and compliant. "You're not weak for trusting your husband," she told me. "That's what marriage is supposed to be. Trust." He weaponized that trust. That's on him, not you. It took time to internalize that, to stop blaming myself for not seeing it sooner, for not being smarter, for not protecting myself better. But gradually, I started to heal, started to rebuild. Not the life I'd had before. I didn't want that life back anyway. A new life, one built on truth instead of lies, on autonomy instead of dependence, on strength instead of fear. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I signed up for a painting class at the Phoenix Art Museum. I'd loved art as a young woman, had dreamed of being an artist, had filled sketchbooks with drawings and ideas. But then life happened. Marriage, responsibilities, Robert's subtle discouragement of anything that took time away from him and our life together. My dreams got shelved, forgotten, buried under decades of making myself smaller. Walking into that first class felt like stepping into a time machine. The smell of paint and turpentine, the scratch of charcoal on paper, the possibility of creating something that existed purely because I wanted it to. It was intoxicating. I was terrible at first. rusty. My hands didn't remember how to translate what my eyes saw onto canvas, but I didn't care. The process itself was healing. Each brushstroke was an act of reclamation. Every finished piece, no matter how amateur, was proof that I could create instead of just endure. The instructor, a woman in her 40s named Elena, pulled me aside after the third class. "There's something raw in your work," she said. "Pain, but also strength. Have you ever considered showing your pieces?" I laughed. The idea of showing my work, of putting myself out there like that, seemed absurd, but Elena was persistent. "There's a community show next month," she said. "Local artists, all ages and skill levels. You should enter something. I think people would connect with what you're expressing." So I did. I painted my bedroom mirror, the one I'd stood in front of that night, barely recognizing my own reflection. In the painting, the woman in the mirror was fragmented, splintered into pieces. But through the cracks, light was coming through. I titled it Reconstruction. 20 people attended that community show. My painting hung in a corner, easy to miss. But 3 people stopped to look at it, really look at it. One was a woman about my age who stood there for a long time before turning to me. "Did you paint this?" she asked. I nodded. "It's my life," she said quietly. "That's exactly how I feel." We talked for an hour. Her story was different from mine, but the same in all the ways that mattered. Financial control, emotional manipulation, the slow erosion of self until she didn't recognize who she'd become. "How did you get out?" she asked. I told her about Linda, about Rebecca, about the months of documentation and planning and fear. I gave her Rebecca's card. I told her it was possible, that she wasn't alone, that there were people who would help. I don't know if she ever called, but I hope she did. That's when I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a blueprint, a map for others who might be lost in the same darkness I'd navigated. And if sharing it could help even one person find their way out, then all the pain had some meaning beyond just my own survival. Now, almost a year after that confrontation in my dining room, I'm living in the house that's fully mine. The mortgage is paid off with Robert's share of the assets. I've redecorated, painted walls in colors I actually like, hung my artwork where his golf trophies used to be. I volunteer at the domestic violence shelter Linda connected me with. I share my story with women who are where I was a year ago, scared, trapped, convinced they can't survive on their own. I show them that they can, that the fear is real, but so is the strength they don't know they have yet. Linda and I are real friends now. We have coffee every Tuesday, and she's become like the sister I wish I'd stayed close to. She helped save my life, and I'll never be able to repay that. She says just watching me rebuild is repayment enough. My actual sister and I are rebuilding our relationship too, slowly. There's hurt there that Robert's isolation caused, years of distance to bridge, but we're trying, and that's something. I paint almost every day now. My spare bedroom has become a studio, and I've started selling pieces online. Nothing that'll make me rich, but enough to feel like I have a purpose beyond just surviving. Creating feels like the opposite of everything Robert did to me. He destroyed, I create, he took, I give, and I'm happy. Actually happy. Not the performance of happiness I maintained for years while slowly dying inside, but real contentment, real peace. The kind that comes from knowing yourself, trusting yourself, building a life that's authentically yours. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this, because if you're listening to this and seeing yourself in any part of my experience, you need to understand how isolation works as a tactic. Abusers don't lock you in a room. They don't need to. They slowly, systematically separate you from anyone who might see what's happening and intervene. It happens so gradually you don't notice until you look around one day and realize you're completely alone. Here's how it works. First, they make seeing other people inconvenient. The drive is too long. The timing doesn't work. Maybe next time. They never outright forbid contact. That would be too obvious. Instead, they create just enough resistance that it's easier to cancel plans than to fight about them. Over time, you stop making plans at all. Then they undermine your relationships with subtle criticism. Your friend is dramatic. Your sister is demanding. Your old colleagues are stuck in the past. They plant seeds of doubt about the people who care about you, making you question whether those relationships are really worth the effort. Meanwhile, they position themselves as your only real support. They're the one who truly understands you, who has your best interests at heart, who you can rely on. Everyone else, they suggest, is unreliable, selfish, or doesn't really get you like they do. By the time you realize you've been isolated, the relationships that could have helped you are already damaged or destroyed. The people who might have noticed something was wrong and spoken up are no longer in your life. You're alone with your abuser, exactly where they wanted you all along. If you're reading the signs of this happening to you or someone you love, here's what you need to know. Healthy relationships don't require isolation. A partner who truly loves you wants you to have strong connections outside the relationship. They encourage your friendships, your family ties, your independence. They don't see other relationships as competition or threat. If someone is systematically cutting you off from your support system, that's not love. That's control. And control is the foundation of abuse, whether it's financial, emotional, physical, or all three. For those of you who recognize this pattern in a friend or family member, please don't give up on them. I know it's hard when someone keeps canceling plans or seems to pull away from you. It's tempting to think they just don't value the relationship anymore, to take it personally and step back yourself. But if you suspect someone is being isolated, keep reaching out. Send texts. Leave voicemails. Let them know you're there when they're ready. Because when they finally do need help, when they finally see what's happening and decide to escape, they'll need to know there's someone on the other side who still cares. I'm so grateful Linda didn't give up on me, even years after we'd been neighbors. Her showing up at my door when I needed her most literally changed my life. She gave me what I needed most, validation that I wasn't crazy, support to build a case, and proof that I wasn't as alone as Robert had made me believe. If you suspect you're being isolated, start rebuilding those connections now. Reach out to old friends, call your family members, join groups or classes where you can meet new people. Create a support network that exists outside your relationship. It might feel difficult or uncomfortable after years of distance, but do it anyway. Your future self will thank you. And if someone tries to stop you or makes it difficult, pay attention to that. People who love you want you to have a full, rich life with many sources of support and joy. People who want to control you want you to have only them. The statistics on isolation are stark. Abusers deliberately separate their victims from support systems in over 75% of cases. It's one of the most reliable predictors of escalating abuse because it works. Isolated people are more vulnerable, more likely to believe they can't leave, more likely to stay in dangerous situations because they have nowhere else to go. But here's the hopeful part. Rebuilding connections is possible. Even after years of isolation, you can reach out. You can explain what happened. Real friends and family will understand. They might be hurt that you pulled away, but they'll also be relieved to have you back. My sister told me something that stuck with me. She said she'd known something was wrong, had felt the distance growing between us, but didn't know how to bridge it without causing a fight with Robert. When I finally reached out to her after the divorce, she cried with relief. She'd been waiting, hoping I'd eventually come back to her. Don't underestimate the power of reconnection, and don't assume it's too late or that too much time has passed. The people who truly care about you want you back in their lives, want to help you, want to support you. All you have to do is reach out. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I know it wasn't easy to hear. These kinds of betrayals never are. But I wanted to share it because silence protects abusers and isolates victims. Speaking up, sharing our stories, that's how we break the cycle. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you in Phoenix like me, watching the sun rise over the desert? Are you across the country in New York, listening during your commute? Are you in a small town somewhere, in a situation that feels impossible to escape? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I want you to know you're not alone. If this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in any part of my journey, please hit that like button. It helps others who need to hear this message find it. And more importantly, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my place? Do you think the justice I got was enough? Have you experienced something similar? Your comments create a community of support for others who might be struggling. When someone reads that they're not the only one, that others have survived and thrived, it gives them hope. And hope is sometimes the difference between staying and leaving, between suffering in silence and finding your voice. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more real stories from real people navigating the complexities of relationships, betrayal, and recovery. Every story we share is another reminder that you're not alone, that survival is possible, and that life can be beautiful again on the other side of trauma. I also want to suggest a couple of related videos that might resonate with you. There's one about recognizing financial abuse early, and another about rebuilding your life after divorce in your 60s. Both have helped others in similar situations, and they might help you too. Until the next story, take care of your heart. Protect it fiercely. Trust it when it tells you something is wrong. And remember that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to start over, to become who you were always meant to be. I'm proof of that. At 62, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning.